Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Bissett and I'm the Director of Leadership Programs at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Some of the congressional staffers in the audience have traveled on official delegations to China with me or my colleague John Lowett, who is here today as well, albeit in the background. It's great to see so many congressional staff joining us. You and the senators and representatives you serve are important to the National Committee, and the National Committee wants to be your educational resource on China. That's why we've established this monthly briefing series to bring you expert perspectives on key issues impacting U.S.-China relations. Today's briefing will examine the potential of a feminist foreign policy as another tool in the diplomacy toolkit to help achieve America's most pressing national and economic security interests, especially as it relates to the U.S.-China relationship. Our goal is for you to walk away with practical steps for operationalizing a feminist foreign policy that you can take back to your bosses and colleagues. This discussion is especially important as we adapt to a new era of competition between the United States and China. And it's timely. 25 years ago this month, officials and activists from 189 countries gathered in Beijing for the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women. This is where the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, considered to be the most comprehensive global policy framework for the rights of women, was adopted. Ever since, women have used the Beijing platform to make gains in legal rights, health, and education. We've indeed taken some steps forward. In 2014, Sweden became the first country to implement a feminist foreign policy. Since then, Norway, Canada, France, Luxembourg, and most recently Mexico have all followed suit with a feminist foreign or development policy. But clearly, significant work remains to be done, especially in the economic, political, and security sectors. For example, only 2 women have ever served as chief negotiators of a peace agreement during the 2 decades since the UN Security Council recognized the importance of women's contributions to peace building and security. Studies have shown that when women are at the table during peacekeeping negotiations, peace is proven to last longer. This matters because according to the experts you will hear from today, gender equity and inclusion are firmly tied to both hard and soft power. Fully implementing a feminist foreign policy would bring a different energy and perspective to bear on solving some of the most significant transnational issues of our time, including climate change, peacekeeping, and global pandemics, all issues that also necessitate U.S.-China cooperation. In fact, linking gender equity and inclusion to our national and economic security is such an important and timely topic that we've opened up this congressional staff briefing to our broader National Committee audience. And we're pleased all of you are here with us today as well. Now on to our experts. You have their bios, so I'll introduce them ever so briefly here to preserve our discussion time. Stephenie Foster is a founding partner of Smash Strategies. From 2012 to 2017, Stephenie served in the U.S. Department of State, both at the U.S. Embassy Kabul and in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. She has decades of experience working at the intersection of diplomacy, development, and gender. Sarah Kemp serves as Merck's Executive Director for Asia Pacific and China Government Relations and Policy Strategy Initiatives. But today she is joining us in her personal capacity, drawing on her long experience in the U.S. government. While in the public sector, she served as the Deputy Undersecretary for the International Trade Administration at the Department of Commerce. Prior to her time in DC, she was the Minister Counselor for Commercial Affairs at the U.S. Embassy, Beijing. As a career foreign commercial service officer, she served as the country manager in China and Vietnam and had multiple postings in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Bangkok. Wenchi Yu is a non-resident research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She served on staff at the State Department's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues from 2009 to 2013, and on the Congressional Executive Commission on China from 2008 to 9. She has worked at various nonprofits and in the private sector. We are also thrilled to count her as a member of the National Committee. Moving on quickly to the run-up show. Each of our speakers will speak for about 8 minutes. Stephenie will lay out the underlying framework for a feminist foreign policy, and Sarah and Wenchi will bring it into focus for the U.S.-China relationship, with Sarah covering trade and Wenchi focusing on diplomacy and technology policy. We will then have a discussion among our experts and leave ample time for audience Q&A. Now I'd like to turn it over to Stephenie Foster for her remarks. Stephenie, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Of course, I'm very happy to be with you all today and happy to be with my panelists, and thank you very much to the National Committee for hosting this important discussion. I am going to talk a little bit about what this feminist foreign policy thing is, because I know it's an interesting and intriguing title, but I think really engaging for the discussion is, what does it mean? How are we looking at foreign policy in a different way that moves really beyond focusing on women's leadership, which is critically important. I think we're at a point where now we're looking at how do we go beyond ensuring there's a more diverse group of people who represent the United States or any other country in diplomacy, development, and defense, to looking at how we then make policy that's really reflective of what's going on in the world, and using a gender analysis tool to ensure that those policies that we all make on behalf of our countries, in my case, the United States, are reflective of really what's happening on the ground. So feminist foreign policy is a way for us to look at who makes decisions, who are the people who are making the decisions, who sits at the table, both in Washington, D.C. and at embassies around the globe. How are those policies that get made? How are they created? What's the process that's used? Is it inclusive? Do we talk to people outside the bubble, outside the people we normally talk to in diplomacy, people who are actually impacted by our foreign policy and national security policy? And then what policies do we create? Do we create policies that are actually reflective, again, of what's going on the ground? And by that, I'm going to come back in a bit and talk about the importance for gender analysis throughout foreign policy and national security decision-making, so that we all understand, as these policies get made, what the impact is on both men and women, boys and girls. So basically, everyone understanding that there is a differential impact and differential lives that get led globally by different sectors of the population. So really, feminist foreign policy integrates critically the goal of gender equality into our national security and foreign policy decision-making. It's based on the idea that we need to embed that in the way we think about foreign policy. We need to understand that there's an importance put on stability, peace, and security, of course, via the way foreign policy works around the world, but that we can't do that if we're ignoring, in most cases, over 51% of the population, the way that that population lives their lives, the way that they are impacted by what goes on in the world. The idea of feminist foreign policy is to bring in women's voices into these decision-making processes across the globe, whether at the State Department or at a peace table, or really even in meetings that occur as decision makers and policymakers are engaging around what's going on in a country. It brings in those voices and those perspectives, as well as embedding, as I said, a gender analysis into foreign policy and national security decision-making. And so when I say that, I want to talk a little bit about what a gender analysis is, because I think it's a really important tool to add to the toolbox. As Jessica said, we're talking about another way to look at issues and to look at the challenges we face. There are many, many analyses and lenses that get and should be used as we develop our policies, as we implement them, as we engage with with other countries, as we engage with multilateral organizations. There are a lot of ways that people who are engaged in this every day look at policy, and they should use whatever types of analyses help them to make better decisions. But a gender analysis is really important because it helps bring in the perspective of looking at how policies impact the entire population. It's another way to broaden the lens, essentially. By bringing a gender lens into this policymaking process, it broadens really the type of information that policymakers have available to them. And so we really are looking at, through the idea of feminist foreign policy and gender analysis, what kind of information is brought into the process. For example, if you're thinking and working on climate change, it's important to know that women are 14 times more likely to be climate refugees than men. That has an impact on the way that we think about developing climate policy. Or if you're thinking about CVE, countering violent extremism, thinking about the fact that we know a certain percentage, albeit small, but 10 to 15% usually, of foreign fighters in a lot of these organizations are women. What does that mean? Are there different ways then to intervene to really try to stop people's engagement and decisions to join those kind of organizations? So I think we really need to think about the role of women in gender analysis as we're developing policies. So the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to my colleagues on the panel is that this really builds on work that's been done over many years. And so as Jessica mentioned, really this started with the Beijing platform in a lot of ways. That was a place that brought together a lot of women's rights activists and feminists around the world who've been working for years. It's not as though Beijing was the first time this was ever talked about, but it is considered the first really broad declaration and platform for action that's comprehensive, and it deals with a lot of issues around how governments and civil society and the private sector should address the issues that are faced by, again, half the population. Building on that, there has been work, obviously, also through the UN Security Council resolutions addressing women, peace, and security, starting with UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Those are really focused, again, on a broad sense of the importance of gender analysis and women's voices, bringing women's voices to the table in peace processes and beyond. But I think then building on those, both of those things, and the general work that's been done across the globe to address the issues around encouraging women's leadership, trying to figure out new ways of solving problems, we've come to a point where there's been, again, starting with Sweden, efforts by governments and multilateral institutions like the UN to really focus on how to develop policies that are more inclusive, policies that bring this information to bear on what we do. I want to also say, because often I'm asked, is this sort of a pacifist foreign policy? Is this really all about soft power, and is feminist foreign policy about avoiding conflict at all costs? And I would say this. First of all, there are many people who say they're feminists and who are engaged in foreign policy. I'm not trying to speak for everyone. So from my view, though, of course, I think part of what feminist foreign policy is about understanding that diplomacy is critical. We need to rebalance the way we think about diplomacy, development, and defense, and see that diplomacy is our first line of engagement in conflict resolution. But this is in no way a policy that says we should never intervene, that we should never engage, if necessary, in armed conflict. It's certainly, from our view and from the view of my co-authors on the paper, are what we should do after we've exhausted our diplomatic options. But this is not a policy that is all about only about soft power. And it's certainly not, at least from my perspective, a policy that says we're about pacifism. It's about bringing in information and analysis into the foreign policy and national security decision-making sphere that really helps those decisions be more effective, that helps us have decisions that actually lead to more stability, security, and peace by undergirding those decisions with information about the impact that they will have on everybody, and taking in information from people in the field who will be impacted by what we do. So I know there are going to be questions, which of course happy to talk about later, but I am going to turn the floor back to Jessica and then on to my next colleague.
Great, thank you so much, Stephenie, for that wonderful foundation. Sarah, let's turn to you and get into some of the specifics surrounding trade.
Sure. So just to pick up on what Stephenie is talking about, obviously there's a direct connection between gender equality and national security. But when I think about a feminist foreign policy, what it means for me is really about taking a holistic approach that uses data to avoid unintended consequences. So what do I mean by avoid unintended consequences? I want to use an example. So not involving women in a labor force leaves vast untapped market potential out of the market. And in countries where the labor force is shrinking, that becomes even more important. And I would posit you just need to look at Japan and look at Abe women economic policies as an example. But in order for there to even be policies, there has to be the data that looks holistically across the economy. Indeed, including women in the economy is hugely important. There was a recent McKinsey report that came out that said advancing women's equity in national economies could add $12 trillion to global growth. And yet, the World Economic Forum's recent report on the gender gap shows that only 55% of women are engaged in the labor market, as opposed to 78% for men. So my personal top 5 facts why we need to ensure that we don't have biases that cause unintended consequences when it comes to including women in business are: 1, in the US, women-owned businesses generated $1.8 trillion every year. 40% of US businesses are women-owned. Only 12% of those export, and that comes, I'm going to touch upon that later when I talk about what Canada's been doing. Last year, or before COVID, every single day, women started 1,821 new businesses. Private tech companies led by women achieve a 35% higher return on investment than those led by men. And in a review of the top 353 Fortune 500 companies by Catalyst, which is a nonprofit, it showed that women that had companies that had high representations of women in their senior leadership had a 35% higher return on equity and a 34% higher total shareholder return than male-dominated firms. So clearly there's an impact. But what does it mean to talk about, since we're talking about foreign policy, I want to talk about trade policy. And for that, I want to use Canada and what Canada's been doing as an example before I get to talk about China. So I'm going to put some assumptions on the table. My assumptions are countries that have an open international trade tend to grow faster, are innovative, have higher productivity. Open trade benefits lower income households by offering consumers more affordable goods and services, and that integrating into a world economy through trade and having a global value chain helps drive economic growth and reduce poverty. I will put a huge caveat. This assumes that all countries are playing by the same rules. So I'm just going to put that on and then put that away. So what was very interesting to me was how Canada looked at this. What Canada did is they looked at how trade impacted men and women differently. And they found that because women are overrepresented in lower growth, lower wage industries like retail, travel, food services, and that men are more likely to be in manufacturing or resource extraction, trade policies had different impacts on men and women, and depending on the sector they were employed in. And as a result, they were impacted differently because free trade agreements impact different sectors differently. So for the first time, what Canada did is they took a gender view or a gender lens and looked at what was the impact of trade agreements on women. And as a result, some of the things they did is they ended up in the most recent negotiations putting a gender chapter in their free trade agreements to address some of the challenges and to intentionally promote women exporting. Their research showed that women were not participating in exporting and that women-owned businesses were smaller in size. So the driving reasons of why were women-owned companies are smaller, the sectors that they are concentrated in, women lacked access to networks, mentors, information, finance, e-commerce. In fact, women-owned businesses are less likely compared to those owned by men to seek loans or outside investment, but they're more likely to have their loan applications rejected on the grounds of insufficient collateral. There's also issues on time constraints. In many countries, women must balance business and family more than men. And then they also found that there was an intersection with violence and harassment in that some women may encounter harassment when traveling outside of their countries, and this impacts their ability and willingness to participate in international fora. So why do we care? Why is this important? Why should governments spend time thinking about why their small and medium-sized companies export? Well, the evidence shows that when companies export, they are more productive, they grow larger, they have higher growth in revenues, they're more resilient to market shocks, they hire more people, including women and other diverse population groups, they pay higher wages, they invest more in R&D, and they invest more in employing training. So there's this huge benefit if we can get more women-owned businesses to export, not only to those businesses, but to sort of the economic society as a whole. So again, what Canada did, which is the first time I had seen this when I was working in trade, was they had a chapter on gender to address some of these challenges. And it lays out things like encouraging capacity building, promoting financial inclusion and access to finance for women who are exporting, advancing women leadership, including advancing women on corporate boards, conducting gender-based analysis, so going back to what Stephenie said about having that data, and then sharing methods and procedures for once you collect this data, how do you use these indicators? How do you use these analysis to talk about trade policy? And I think that's very impactful. I know we're here to talk about China, so I'm going to turn now to China, but I wanted to put the Canada example out there of what some countries are doing and what is possible. My experience as a diplomat, I did 6 of my 8 tours in Asia, many of them in Hong Kong and China, and from my experience, China was the place where I experienced the least sexism. I found that the respect that I gained was based on my title, as opposed with my US colleagues and in the US, where I might have had the title, but that was the entry point, and then I had to prove myself. I can remember as a junior Foreign Service officer watching Minister Wu Yi negotiate with Secretary Brown, Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown. She was tough, she was disarming, she really connected with Secretary Brown, her counterpart, and she knew her brief. And I remember being completely impressed with how she was able to have a very tough conversation in a very graceful way. And I think that sort of embodies some of what I think this is about. In life, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So how could a feminist foreign policy create common ground in the U.S.-China relationship? I think it would allow, as Stephenie said, allows for more divergent voices to be heard, those for decoupling and those for engagement, so we can get at the underlying issues that prevent trust between our two countries. It would focus on things that impact people's daily lives, you know, clean health, clean water, air, food, health of a population, having everyone involved in the economy. When I was Minister Counsel for Commercial Affairs, I challenged the team to look for areas of what I called U.S. China shared prosperity, looking for pain points in China, for example, bad air, you know, air pollution, soil issues, and how could we use U.S. products and services to address them. But it's not just, as Stephenie said, it's not just in sort of the soft areas, right? It was across all industries. And I would argue, to Stephenie's point, how cool would it be if we had more women in the 6-party talks? What would that do to change the dynamic of the 6-party talks with North Korea? I don't know, just something to throw out there. But as for recommendations for a feminist trade policy, again, what Stephenie said, analyzing gender impacts. And I would say you could look at how the World Bank does it or how MCC does it. Setting targets for public procurement for women-owned businesses, encouraging board participation in the economy. When I was in Beijing and in Vietnam, I set up the chapter for women corporate directors, which is about providing training to give women the skill set so they can actively participate and be considered for corporate boards. Looking at what Canada has done on FTAs in terms of how does a gender lens, how do we look at trade and how it impacts women? And then support for the investment of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which also encourages women's participation in leadership and on boards. And then specific recommendations for how we reset U.S.-China relations using a feminist policy lens. I would say focus on connecting women-owned small, medium-sized enterprises in both countries and what trade measures can both countries take to do that? Start with mayors and governors of both countries. Most of the mayors in China are women. Something like 500 out of the 528 are women. And their brief includes healthcare, climate, sort of the things that impact daily needs. So how cool would it be if we had a group of mayors from both countries together to talk about what are the best practices of dealing with COVID? All mayors had to deal with that. Is there a way we can use that kind of fora and those kind of topics to, again, build trust? Or establish a group of U.S. and China experts to look at infectious diseases and how collaboratively could we look at third countries? If the U.S. and China are the superpowers, what is our responsibility and how could we work together in addressing some of these challenges in Latin America or Africa? I would also say restart and encourage scientific and technical exchanges, whether that's the space discussions or what the National Science Foundation is doing. What I found is that we were most impactful when we were able to be more technical. So all of our discussions on IP, for example, when we could be technical and where there was an aligned interest. It's in China's interest, for example, to have a strong IP because they want their companies to compete internationally, so they first have to compete domestically. But where can you find those areas of what I call shared prosperities that also have a technical intersection so it isn't politicized? So I'll stop there, and I think I'm handing it over to Wenchi now to talk more about another area, about more security, I think.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Stephenie, for laying the framework to think about what does it mean for gender integration into our foreign policy. And so I am actually going to look at specifically how it looks like when we say we're integrating gender and women into our thinking and doing in our foreign policy. And so I'll give a quick review of, what we've been doing since Beijing conference in 1995, 25 years ago. Some of the initiatives, bipartisan, from both administrations led by both Republicans and Democrats, and specifically, what it looks like in our foreign policy and diplomatic initiatives. Since I know that many people, listeners or viewers today, are actually, involved in whether it's congressional or in your daily job, something related to foreign policy and diplomacy. So quickly, yes, in 1995, when the UN Women's Conference took place in Beijing, and after that, I think the US and around the world, governments realized, how much desire there was to actually engage and discuss various issues related to women. So at that time, President Clinton created the White House Interagency Council on Women. The name at that time was Interagency Council on Women. So it was a mechanism directed from the White House with all federal agencies to look at how can we integrate women into what you're doing, policymaking and execution. And in the State Department, they created a position that directly reports to Secretary of State, Senior Coordinator for International Women's Issues. And so they also created all kinds of diplomatic initiatives, to support democracy movements, to be part of peace negotiation processes, as well as a lot of civil society and political participation type of work. And moving on to the Bush administration, they had a little bit different approach. They did not continue sort of the White House Interagency Council on Women. However, whether it's Mrs. Bush sitting in the White House, who personally took on a lot of women and health initiatives. So HIV/AIDS, especially in Africa, through PEPFAR funding, working closely with the State Department and USAID, really have, I would say, drawn the global attention to this issue and putting money where it should be. Mrs. Bush also took on, human rights issues like Burma, supporting women's rights, and of course, the Afghan women. At that time, that was when our country really, had started this war with Afghanistan, and what we saw on TV, the images of women in Afghanistan, I think, basically really garner global attention. So that was during the Bush administration, and obviously Secretary Rice also started the International Women of Courage Award that they recognize courageous women around the world every year. And then in the Obama administration, not only, he appointed Secretary Clinton as the first female, as the Secretary of State, but also appointed and created the very first position to work on global women's issues, ambassador for global women's issues. And again, sort of consolidated different offices within the State Department. So there's a very focused effort to integrate gender into our foreign policy and diplomacy. And then, moving on to the Trump administration, there's the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. So I ran this down because I think it's important for everyone to recognize, integrating gender and women is not a partisan issue. We've seen both parties really taking on this issue. It may look differently, but certainly, it is to the core of our U.S. interests, and that's why we're seeing it being implemented and carried out in both, I would say, Republican as well as Democratic administrations. But the evolution of thinking on women and gender in our foreign policy, I think, has also been really interesting. So early on, a lot of people think about sort of working on women's issues sort of more, okay, seeing women as victims need protection, right? Violence against women, and women and children are the ones that are most affected and need most protection during conflicts. Two, later thinking, which is more, okay, women are drivers of change. Women are agents of economic development. Women are entrepreneurs. Women are political leaders, civil society leaders. So the agency is different. And the conversation discussion also moved from focusing on women as a group to actual gender integration in everything we do. And hence, Stephenie articulated really, really well in the beginning, sort of how we are thinking about it right now. And, as Sarah talked about, sort of focusing on the trade and gender statistical, I would say, analysis. Now, what does it mean in U.S. China? Also, I'm just going to share some concrete examples, and I'm going to use during Secretary Clinton's time, because that's when I served in the government. It does not mean, the gender or women initiatives are not happening or did not happen in other times. The first trip, if some of you remember, especially pay attention to China, the very, very first foreign trip Secretary Clinton took was to East Asia. And during her stop in Beijing, and I remember really well, there was this request from the Secretary's office to actually convene a group of women's rights advocates in China, because we always know human rights issues, we don't see eye to eye with China on a lot of the human rights issues. And sometimes hitting them directly on human rights issues in their territory is not most welcome. So we use women's rights as a way to engage with women's lawyers, public interest lawyers, as well as a lot of the advocates that maybe the Chinese authorities don't like, but in some way is to show the U.S. Support for those courageous women. That's in practice how it looks like. And during the 4 years of her time, I remember very well, in 2010, during the U.S. China Security and Economic Dialogue, and Sarah will remember, it's an annual sort of, entourage between two sides coming together to talk about big security and economic issues. And we were part of it in Beijing. And during that time, there was a discussion about, if the two countries can actually find another venue for engagement, which is people to people, because there's so much desire to engage beyond just hard security and economic and trade issues. So what we were seeing was, at that time, it was led in China by Liu Yandong, their most senior female political leader, who happens to lead a lot of health education, sports, culture, and related issues. And so in 2011, during the launch of the People-to-People Dialogue, we also included women as part of the dialogue. And, the two countries were able to come together and talk about work and family issues, women and employment issues, domestic violence issue, which is a topic that China actually wanted to talk about and wanted to learn, from the U.S., how the U.S. courts and police really deal with those issues. So I'm using those examples as a way to say that, okay, if you include women and gender in your foreign policy and diplomacy, it's a very, very useful tool for engagement. And it's not just, as Stephenie said, it's not just for soft issues. You can use that to talk about really hard human rights issues. For example, what's happening now in Xinjiang, right? Or in the past, China's forced population policy has always been, I would say, a contentious issue between US and China, because we believe in a different set of value than what they were doing at that time. I think we have very little time left. I'm just gonna point out a few things that lay it out there. I don't have any answer, not that we're doing anything right now to address it, but look at currently, I would say in our government right now, who are the core decision makers on Asia or US China? Two of the largest countries in the world have consequential impact on the whole world. But the key decision makers right now in our government, I think they all kind of look the same. And so there's no scientific, I would say, evidence to say anything, but I think it does lead to certain style of dealing with right now. And so it's a different kind of energy, I would say. And then if you look at in Washington, D.C., in the world where I live in, people who work on public policy issues or who represent companies or nonprofit organizations working on public policy issues or lobbying, doing government relations, the majority of them are also men. And women tend to focus on nonprofits or philanthropy, doing really nice things. I think that also says a lot about sort of, when we look at holistically how we think about, foreign policy, national security. And I don't want to say soft power, but I actually like Anne-Marie Slaughter's term, which is smart power. It's a much sort of comprehensive way to look at the tools that US can actually deploy. I think I'm gonna stop there.
Great, we're right on time in terms of the schedule, so thank you, Wenchi. I think I wanna kind of jump back to Stephenie. First of all, thank you to the three of you. Great fodder for us to work with for the rest of the time. Stephenie, I mentioned at the beginning a few countries that have implemented a feminist or a development foreign policy. And I know you've done a ton of work in this area. What have we seen in terms of impact of feminist foreign policies in these countries? Could you talk a little bit more about that? And then additionally, Sarah, I would turn to you to comment as well. And you talked a lot about Canada and what they've done. Our neighbors to the north, we have a lot in common, also a lot of differences. We're a major world power, they're a middle power, so to speak. What's holding us back from doing something similar? So I'll start with that.
Sure, I'll start. I mean, I will say, so Sweden was the first country to formally adopt a feminist foreign policy 2014. So it's been 6 years. So just to think we have a 6-year window to really look at in terms of what the impact has been. I want to say a little bit about Sweden, a little bit about Canada, which adopted a feminist development policy in 2017, and then France in 2019. Really, what I think we've seen from Sweden, and this is really very anecdotal, but in talking to a lot of Swedish diplomats here in Washington, and then also through just engaging with them on various calls and meetings, they talk about the fact that the adoption of a feminist foreign policy really has changed the way that they interact with in the countries in which they're posted, that they now understand and think about more broadly the need to engage with broader groups of people, looking at gender equality as an imperative, thinking about who's at the table, and really broadening the scope of issues that are dealt with. So I think that it's anecdotal. I'm sure someone is probably writing a PhD dissertation as we speak on the actual impact of these policies, and if you're not, by the way, good idea for someone. But I think what diplomats say is that it really has broadened the aperture for them, and that it's very much now an idea of feminist foreign policy is embedded in the bureaucracy, which I think as we talk about this from a US and really a government perspective, critically important. Adopting a policy is one thing, but embedding that into the bureaucracy and changing the norms around how quote unquote business is done is important. And there are lessons we can learn there about the need to ensure that we're, of course, thinking about who's at the table, like physically, are there women and men at the table? But people, although that is important who they are, but what are the things we can change so that there are systems in place and infrastructure in place to actually make a feminist foreign policy and a gender analysis a critical part of what we do. And I think that's something that as we talk about what the Hill can do, really holding agencies and accountable to say, how have you looked at putting a gender analysis into the work that you do? Do you have a requirement that every piece of paper that goes up through the chain, including to the president's daily brief, has a gender analysis in it, has a section on gender that isn't just checking the box, like this is what, we need to ensure that that is happening. One thing I'll say on that, and this is vis-a-vis USAID, certainly in procurement for USAID contracts was implemented during the Obama administration, and I think it's still in place. You had to look at the gender impact of the proposal you were putting forward. And, again, in fits and starts, that was implemented, but at a certain point, proposals were being sent back if they didn't have enough of a gender analysis of what this work would do. So I think one of the lessons to learn from Sweden, certainly, and all the countries, but from Sweden particularly, is what can we do institutionally to really make change so that it's not just who's the person at the top. Because as I always say, not all women are feminists and not all feminists are women. So right, we need to make sure we're putting in both people, but also processes that outlast all of us who go into government and out of government. The second thing I want to say about Canada and France, I'm going to lump them together a little bit because they were each presidents of the G7 respectively right before we're the president now. We hold the pen, and it was France and Canada before us. They each used the G7 to really advance gender as a really integral part of the discussions of the G7 countries. That had been going on for a while. When I was at State, I worked on the G7 and really focused on including women, and particularly around peace and security issues, increasing the number of women mediators and getting a commitment from G7 countries around that. But France and Canada really upped the game, right? They created a Gender Equality Council. They really put forward in all of their G7 work, you know, the importance of a gender lens. So I think what we see from them is it's not just within your own government, but how you can take a feminist foreign or development policy and really engage at the multilateral level or at the global level, to really take to take like the G7 or the G20 or the UN, but and really push forward and make your make your commitment more institutionalized as well. So I think there are lots of other things to learn, but I would point to those 3 things that I think we know right now.
Sarah, did you want to add something as well?
Sure, and I'm just going to echo a lot of what Stephenie already said, is that, you know, my opinion is it's an opinion unless there's data and you can measure it, right? So the biggest thing that I saw that Canada did was really that comprehensive looking and gaining data so that you don't have unintended consequences, and looking across the whole spectrum, men, women, different sections of the population. How does trade impact these different groups? That's an important thing to base policy on. So again, if you can't measure it, does it really happen? And to Stephenie's point about embedding it in, I also say I'm really impressed with Canada took a comprehensive approach. They also had a very intentional approach to increase women businesses and women exporters. And what they also did, I had a fascinating conversation with my then counterpart, who also was a woman, by Hampton Dam. And she said, yeah, I gave it to my top male trade person because I didn't want it to be the female thing, right? And that's she was intentional in not what she did, but how they did it. And I think that went a long way to say, this isn't the female thing, this is good for the economy. And we are doing this because it's good for the economy. And I thought that was a very important part of how Canada positioned what they did in trade.
Great. Wenchi, I want to turn to you with a question that was pre-submitted. It's from Cindy Chin, CEO of CLC Advisors. How have the Trump administration's policies towards Taiwan impacted the U.S.-China relationship? What path forward do you see? And I'll add on, how would a feminist foreign policy influence either the current or future administration's policy towards Taiwan?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy, for that question. I think, you know, she and I are both Taiwanese Americans who care a lot about what's going on in Taiwan. I think definitely deserves everyone's attention. I think historically, we always look at, you know, the U.S. policy towards Taiwan in the context of U.S. China, right? Because of the history and everything else. But, you know, increasingly, I think there's this realization, recognition that, you know, treating Taiwan independently, separately, as, you know, a polity and economic, I would say, you know, entity differently from, you know, mainland China is essential for various reasons, especially national security and values. So I think one thing the Trump administration has done a good job is really when it comes to support what Taiwan represents, which is a democratic success in Asia. One of the very first, its record on supporting LGBT rights, gay marriage. And more recently, especially COVID, what we're seeing is really Taiwan's outstanding record in managing COVID situation. And so I think there are a lot of sort of, you know, good stories out of Taiwan that are very much, I would say, aligned with, you know, some of our traditional values, especially I would say when it comes to democracy. You know, gender equality is also one big thing, although I would say that really started in the Obama administration, just in terms of, you know, using gender as a way to highlight Taiwan's record on gender. Obviously, you know, I think this kind of improvement in terms of relationship between US and Taiwan irks, you know, China. So, I mean, we're seeing some reactions from China. And so I think, I mean, we're in the middle of it, right? China has been using lots of threats. So, I think one thing we should look at is, again, applying gender perspective. Taiwan's first president, President Tsai, has really managed COVID really, really well. And she is a very, very well-respected president. But in the world, and they just appointed the very first female representative to the United States, Ambassador Kim Shao, also, who is now taking on a much more comprehensive approach in terms of Taiwan's engagement in the United States, using a lot of what they call soft power, but again, I like to use the term smart power. So sports, health, educational outreach, gender, and other things, much more than sort of the traditionally narrowly defined political and military engagement.
So just a quick follow-up question on that from my boss, National Committee Vice President Jan Barris. You guys are on the same wavelength. She wanted you to ask about Tsai Ing-wen, how she's governed, and whether or not you think she's carried out a feminist foreign policy. You mentioned COVID, and we've seen countries and areas in which female leaders have been in charge of the COVID response, that it's, to put it lightly, gone better than in other places. But Jan was wondering if you could perhaps touch upon other elements of foreign policy. You mentioned sports diplomacy and other areas of smart power, but if you have anything else to expand specifically about Tsai Ing-wen, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been sort of observing President Tsai over the last, I would say, 20 years. She started as a scholar and a key negotiator between China and Taiwan. So during her time in, 20 years ago, she personally was instrumental in terms of, making a lot of the economic and trade ties possible to really improve, I would say, what matters to people on a daily basis. So she really understands, I would say, the economic and trade issues. And I would say before she became the president, she ran for the president, in 2012, which wasn't successful. And, got to sort of watch her. She never really feels comfortable in terms of talking about, at that time, her female identity, right? Because that wasn't a big issue back then. And there was also a lot of speculation about her sexual orientation, right? Because she's still not married. There were always rumors about she's, lesbian, etc., never had children. And even during the last presidential campaign, her not having children became an issue because some, her opponents were saying, well, if she didn't have children, how would she understand, how to raise a family, what policies matter to family, etc. So I would say her realization of a more gender and women really was learned. But what you're noticing is that throughout the years, and she's become so much more confident, especially during the second term, you can notice in terms of, just her being comfortable with who she is, and really leads, especially during COVID, I would say, very deferential to health experts. And basically, obviously there's very competent health officials in the government, including former vice president, etc., and the current vice president, also a doctor. So, I would say she's very comfortable in her skin in terms of who she is. That may be it. I mean, she's secure about who she is and acknowledges and recognizes, what she can do and she cannot do. And what her party actually represents is more like, in some way, not entirely, but value-wise, more like the Democratic Party in the United States, because they're more left-leaning. They care more about, for example, the farmers, a lot of the workers, and it is less interested in big businesses. So, that's some just interesting observation of, how she has changed over the years.
Great, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. We have another question that I'm going to pose to all of you. It's from Teresa Pure, sorry if I'm messing up your last name, from Oxfam America. She says, in his agenda for women, Biden has pledged to fully implement the Women, Peace, and Security Act and to strive for gender parity in his national security and foreign policy appointments. Beyond these pledges, what else should a President Biden do to implement a feminist foreign policy, especially with regard to the U.S. China relationship? Any takers for that one?
Well, I'll start just more broadly on feminist foreign policy. And I think at the end, we're going to talk specifically as well about some things that Congress, the legislative branch can do. I mean, certainly I would say, just so people know, that Women, Peace, and Security Act was signed into law in 2017 after being, many years in the making in Congress, but was signed into law by President Trump in 2017. And each of the main agencies has done an implementation plan. They came out earlier this year. So I think, yes, Vice President Biden, candidate Biden, has said he would implement the WPS Act. And I think it's really important to say, what other things can he do, but what does that mean? I mean, one certainly thing, which is diversification of who's in office, right? Making sure that there are equal numbers of men and women, diverse in other ways as well, at all levels of foreign policy, national security, and frankly, domestic appointments, right? This is a time where I think we see also the importance of understanding that foreign and domestic policy are much more inextricably intertwined than ever before. I will note just two words, COVID-19, right? I mean, we are living in a world where what happens around the world matters here very starkly to people. And I would say that's also, just as an aside, one of the things that we think about as we think about feminist foreign policy is actually broadening the issues that get seen as foreign policy issues. Historically, I think we have this sense of what that is, government to government discussions about high important issues of, whatever it is about between a country's bilateral relationship. But I think now we're seeing things like global health are huge, huge foreign policy issues, climate change, huge. Things that I think before, maybe kind of at the edges, people were thinking were important to foreign policy and national security. Now it's very obvious. So I think diversifying representation, really broadening the set of issues, seeing trade and economic issues for what, as well as foreign policy and national security issues, labor rights issues, agriculture issues. I mean, there are a multitude of ways that the U.S. government engages with governments and people overseas, and we need to think about those in a holistic way. So that's another thing I think that the Biden administration or any administration could and should do, is really be a much more broad, have a more broad spectrum of the issues that comprise foreign policy and national security. I'll just say two other things. Obviously, I think ensuring that we get input from those who are affected by our foreign policy decisions in a much more structured way. To me, and from working at the State Department, but just broadly, I think it's important for us to understand that we need to, as diplomats and those who give advice to foreign policy decision makers, that we need to have input from those who are actually affected on the ground. It's easy to say sitting in the Capitol here, or even in the Capitol, when you're in a country. I served in the embassy in Afghanistan. Thank you to some of my former U.S. Embassy Kabul colleagues who've gotten on the call. But you learn a lot there, but you learn a lot when you go out and talk to people, like not outside the embassy walls, outside the Capitol, really ensuring that there are mechanisms in place for that. So I think I would just end by saying on this sort of note that it's about not just relying on people who are committed to do that because they think it makes them better diplomats or better policymakers, but institutionalizing them, figuring out ways to change the structure and the system so that everybody has to, do a gender analysis, think about who's impacted, make sure there are the right people at the table, and broaden our view of what we need to look at so that we are making decisions that make all of us more safe and secure and more prosperous.
Sarah or Wenchi, anything to add?
No, I think I covered it in my remarks about some specific recommendations on, you could do public procurement, encouraging women on boards. There are sort of micro policies that you could do in the trade vertical that could enhance a feminist trade policy. But I think Stephenie called them out pretty broad, that first and foremost, you've got to put an emphasis on knowing the data and knowing what's currently taking place. And I would say what Stephenie said about inclusion also should be extended to domestic as well, like get outside of Washington.
Agreed. We've gotten a couple of questions about what's going on in Xinjiang. And I know, Wenchi, you briefly touched upon this in your remarks, but a couple of people have asked or stated the Chinese government has purportedly used forced sterilization in Xinjiang as a means of controlling and subduing the Uyghur population. Please speak a little bit more about that, as well as the internment camp tactics using the lens of a feminist foreign policy. Would using a feminist foreign policy lens change the way in which the U.S. government has approached what's going on in Xinjiang?
Yeah, I think people have seen the news stories coming out, just, it's been going on for years. So obviously, it's not just sort of the forced sterilization. I still remember when I actually, bring home in terms of for the congressional staffers, when I was working at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, Xinjiang at that time, especially the Chinese government's treatment to ethnic minorities in general, came up as an issue. And at that time, we also noticed forced labor as an issue, for example, using the workers there to pick cotton, but it really is slave labor issue. So it had been featured in our annual trafficking in persons report, even, just more than 10 years ago. It's been, so it's not news in the human rights world. I think what we're probably noticing more is sort of a more comprehensive kind of, control of the ethnic minority by the Chinese government. And what you would notice is what they are doing now in Xinjiang is essentially copying what they did in Tibet. And actually the current, I would say the political leader in Xinjiang came from Tibet. So it's a very sad story. And, I think it's, the US government has been critical. I haven't seen sort of the women's office or, other ones, I think the question is what tools can we use other than criticizing, right? This is when, are we getting allies from around the world? Are we, working with the UN system, for example, to have something that's more than just sort of, this is US criticism of China. And I do want to acknowledge that, various European governments have come out and Muslim majority countries have come out to criticize this just cruel and horrendous practice and policy in Xinjiang against Uyghurs.
We have a follow-up question from another National Committee colleague, Margot Landman. Following up on Stephenie's comments about getting feedback from those affected by US policy in the China context, where American diplomats' access to ordinary Chinese people is often limited, how would she recommend institutionalizing getting that input? And I think, Sarah, you probably have some thoughts about this from your time on the ground as well.
Sure. I mean, I think Margot's absolutely right. You have to institutionalize this. The easiest way, if you want to get the embassy to report something, is make it a reporting requirement, right? Stick it on a 301 report, stick it on an NTE report, stick it on there's any number of ways. But to Margot's point of how do you do it when there is limits, and there's now new limits, right? In terms of getting out and interacting. That does become more difficult, but I would say there's this wonderful thing called WeChat and social media, where how do we use technology to start trying to get input on what's going on? And I don't know if we've done as much in the government as the private sector has on really using that tools and mechanisms as another way to augment. And I think Wenchi's got some experience, so I'm gonna punt it over to her to follow up on that one. But Margot, it's an excellent question, because if you don't report it, if you don't institutionalize it, it's a blip. But I do think what the US government is good at is when you get something into an annual report that goes to Congress, yes, it becomes institutionalized.
Thanks, Sarah, for throwing that question to me. I think we're in this hot water now between U.S. and China when it comes to sort of technology competition, right? I don't want to use Cold War or any other, terms yet to frame it, although it does feel that way. I think fundamentally it comes down to competition for leadership and for global dominance. What the U.S. has realized is just how competitive China has been in a relatively short amount of time. And if you want to have economic dominance, having the most advanced technologies, whether it's AI, 5G, and bio, and any kind is essential, right? So I think that's a huge question for our U.S. government in terms of how do we make our competitiveness strong, and the approach in appearance that the U.S. government currently is taking now is to make sure that there's a level playing field. I think there's this feeling, and Sarah, you would know much better, that the U.S. business access to the Chinese market is not entirely fair, and so we're not really competing on the same level. I think that's fundamentally what they're trying to address. There are many other political issues, obviously, added to the play, and there's also domestic politics. It's an election year, so it's just so complicated right now. It's really hard to sort of dice and see anything clearly right now. But one thing I want to come back to our competitiveness issue and drive home, because ultimately, a stronger United States, if we have a stronger economy, a healthier and educated population, that's when you can have a strong foreign policy. And I think, foreign policy in especially in any democracy, is an extension of our domestic priorities. And I think what we're seeing is that we haven't invested enough domestically. And I want to use one example just to show how everything is connected. So when I was working for one of the top investment banks in the world, living in Beijing, we already noticed sort of, the US business is less competitive. Obviously, there are restrictions. That's one sort of regulatory level kind of issue we need to address. But there's also this fundamental lack of understanding of local markets. And for especially big businesses, and I'm only using my former employer as an example, because what we noticed was the bankers, the big shop bankers, most of them are men, and they like to chase deals that are state-owned enterprises, the big ones. Right? They're very also traditional because that's what they're used to in terms of, big money, quick money. And then I noticed that female partners, they started paying attention to the new economy type of businesses. So Alibaba, for example, the very first investor from Goldman Sachs was actually a woman who recognized this e-commerce is going to be the future. And so she was the one that led the company to invest in Alibaba. And then later on, when I remember having a conversation with a female partner, and she was saying, look, health and education will be the most profitable businesses because that's the future. And so that's when we should pay our attention to and chase after all these businesses. But at that time, that wasn't really on most of the male bankers' radar, because they're still chasing after the already established big ones. And they tend to be state-owned, and they tend to be coal, the construction and the big ones. And so I think you can see just how female and male perspectives is played into this, right? Because our female partners, she has a family, she cares about her children, she cares about her parents' health, and that's how she looks at how to pick businesses. And so fast forward, just a few years later, I mean, I think we can see that, a lot of US banks, even though we have the licenses to do wholly owned business now in mainland China, but I think, we're losing the edge. I have to say, and it's across the board. So, that's just one example how, this truly matters in terms of your competitiveness, how you access a market, and ultimately, it comes down to how we understand what kind of information are we gathering.
Great. We're almost out of time, so I want to quickly turn back to Stephenie, who is going to give us a few takeaways, practical steps for members of Congress and staff and anyone else who works in foreign policy in a professional capacity can take to implement a feminist foreign policy.
Great. Well, I have like 5 or 6 things, so I'm going to run through them. I would say for anybody on this call in your work, always make sure you are looking for, asking, and getting data disaggregated by sex, right? So you see the differential impact. You can also look for data disaggregated on a number of other things, but for sure, I can't tell you the number of times I've asked people like, how many women, own businesses, how many women go to school, how many women are, impacted by climate change or move because of that, and there is no data. How many women are you thinking about reaching through this outreach program? No. So just ask for sex disaggregated data, everybody. That's one thing that's really important, and it can really inform policy no matter where and what. So I'll start with that. But specifically to this set of issues and for Hill staff, I mean, I think there are several things that are very important. Sponsoring resolutions and legislation around this issue. I'm just going to have a few examples of things I know that are happening right now. I happen to know that Representative Speer has a resolution supporting feminist foreign policy. I think it's still open for co-sponsors. I know there are laws, legislation that's been introduced, for example, around how to reform the State Department, make sure that there's a more diverse group of people who work there. So lots of different pieces of legislation that get at parts of feminist foreign policy, diversification of staff being really the one that's the most focused on right now in terms of what's happening legislatively. Secondly, or thirdly, I guess, make sure when you're looking at the experts you call to testify before a committee or a subcommittee, or that you reach out to do so, make sure that's a balanced group of people. Susan Markham and I recently wrote an article in The Hill that talks about the numbers, and it's, on the Senate side right now, about 30% of witnesses are women before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. On the House side, it's about 40% in front of HFAC. Those numbers are not bad, but they could be better, and we want to make sure that women are experts called on every issue, not just on the soft issues, not just on women's issues, but on nuclear non-proliferation, on issues of defense spending. There are women experts out there on every single one of those issues. And so I think about who you call. That's really important. It really sends a signal. It also helps those women's careers, and that means that they'll probably be able to move through their careers in a much accelerated way. I would also say ask questions at hearings, in meetings, in your interactions with government, with executive branch officials. Again, about gender analysis, sex disaggregated data. Have you looked at what the differential impact is on people? Depending on their sex, their race, their age, whatever the analytics are, but ask those questions, because as someone I worked on the Hill, and I worked in obviously the State Department. When you're on the side of the State Department, have to answer those questions, you're sort of annoyed, but that is, after all, the job of the Hill, is to make us, accountable, and I guess somewhat annoyed by having to be accountable for that. And then, just as another sort of subtopic of that is, think about whether, as you're developing legislation, you can embed a requirement for gender analysis into that, or for a gender policy. Obviously, several agencies have gender policies, USAID, the State Department, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But think about, are there ways to deepen that, broaden that across agencies? Are there ways to hold people accountable, whether they're implementing the actual policy that exists as they're revising policies? Are they looking at the best practices? So I think there are lots of things that, as part of oversight capacity, Hill offices can do. And if there are further questions, of course, I'm happy to have you reach out to me via the National Committee and help you look at ways to really make small changes seemingly, but that can have a really big impact.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephenie, Sarah, and Wenchi for speaking to us today. We're out of time. We've gone a little bit over. And many thanks to everyone for joining. We know you're busy and we appreciate your time. For the congressional staffers on the call, we hope you'll be back with us next month for our next briefing. And for everyone, we hope you will join us for future National Committee programs. And we invite you to go on our website and you can subscribe to our events distribution. A video for this program will be available and posted to our website, so please check back in the next week or so. And thank you again, everyone, for spending now close to 80 minutes with us. We hope you have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you again soon on Zoom. Bye, everyone, and thank you.